As tourists waited behind the gates, taking photographs of Buckingham Palace, the changing of the guard had just come to an end, and the rhythmic stomping of boots had faded into the background. In the midst of the never-ending responsibilities that come with his position, King Charles took a break to indulge in some privacy by going for a stroll outside. The only thing he was looking for was some fresh air and a chance to clear his mind. He wasn't looking for anything unique. On the other hand, something drew his attention. Something was set down by a guard who was stationed at his position close to the entrance of the palace. A little notebook that had been damaged fell out of his sleeve and landed on the pavement underneath him. It wasn't the kind of thing that most people would notice because it was worn at the edges and wasn't very much. As for Charles, he did. There was a brief moment of hesitation on the part of the guard, as if he was considering whether or not to break form and retrieve it. After that, Charles did something that was completely unexpected. Getting down on his knees, he scooped it up by himself. Charles said this while offering the notebook back to the guard when he said it. When he took it back, the man became rigid, his hold becoming stronger. Despite the fact that his voice was firm, there was a flicker in his eyes. There was a brief moment of discomfort and perhaps even some humiliation. For some reason that Charles could not quite put his finger on, his stare lingered for a fraction of a second longer as he straightened up. Just then, he became aware of it. There was something wrong with the guard's outfit. It possessed the same crimson tunic, the same well-defined lines, and the same presence that could not be missed. However, upon closer inspection, something seemed odd. The cloth appeared to be worn and had a tiny fade to it. The cuffs were not as crisp as they had been before, and there was a faint stain on the lower hem of his jacket at the edge. Charles examined the man's face in an attempt to find an answer. However, the guard had already returned to his position, his eyes fixed forward and his posture straight, as if nothing had occurred. In spite of the fact that Charles left, the moment remained in his mind. In no circumstances could the outfit of a royal guard be anything less than flawless. When he finally arrived at the doors of the palace, an idea had already taken hold in his head, and he was unable to eliminate it. There was a problem with that individual, and Charles was trying to locate the source of the problem. After returning to the palace, Charles was unable to shake the image of the guard, which included the man's hesitancy, the fading clothing, and the way that the guard had tensed when their hands briefly touched. Not only was there a stain on a jacket, but there was also something more profound, something that was not quite right. Later that evening, while Charles was sitting in his study, he casually brought it up to Sir Edward, who was his senior assistant officer. While Charles was stirring the tea in his cup, he reflected about a strange occurrence that had occurred earlier. A uniform that was not quite correct, appeared to be worn and soiled, and belonged to one of the guards. Sir Edward, a man who adhered to a strict regimen and maintained a high level of decorum, hardly looked up from his documents. As they stood there for hours, Your Majesty, Charles scowled and suggested that perhaps he was just about ready for a new pair. That's possible, but he wasn't convinced by it. Royal guards were held to an unbelievably high level. Their uniforms were more than simply clothes, they were symbols, they did not fray, they did not stain, and they did not appear to be tired in any way. When Edward finally became aware of the king's determination, he inquired about the guard in question. The individual who was located close to the main gate dropped something, a notebook, and was uneasy when I handed it back to him. Edward nodded and made a little note for himself. Despite the fact that I will have the commander verify the duty roster, that was not sufficient. All of Charles's life had been spent seeing people concealing things that they did not want him to see. It was clear to him what it was like to suffer in silence. While he was placing his cup down, he stated, "I want a report." He wanted to know not only his name, his record, his living condition, but everything. Edward paused for a fraction of a second, which was just enough time for Charles to seize the opportunity. "Surely, Your Majesty, this is not something that is required. Carry it out." Following that, the conversation came to an end. This request was made in a stealthy manner, and it was communicated through the necessary channels without much hoopla. There was no one who questioned the king's curiosity. At least, it was not permitted. In the morning, the report would appear on his desk, buried beneath the normal briefings, and when Charles opened it, he would know that his instincts had been absolutely correct all along. There was something that was not quite right about that guard. There was a very, very serious thing wrong. A big folder was placed on King Charles' desk just as the sun was beginning to peek above Buckingham Palace in the morning sunshine. a standard personnel report, including dates of service, commendations, and nothing out of the ordinary was meant to be included in the document, which was marked as confidential. Nevertheless, Charles felt a tightening in his stomach as he turned the pages of the book. This was not at all a typical occurrence. During his time in the military, the Guard, whose name is Thomas Whitaker, served. There were no disciplinary issues, there were compliments for the good service, and the record was textbook. But Charles then came upon the last section, which was titled Current Residence. No fixed address was mentioned in any of the 3 times that he read it. A guy who spent his days standing in a position of honor and protecting the most famous palace in the world had no place to go back to after he was done with his duties. King Charles has recently learned that his royal guard is without a house, and the next day, he finds himself in the most shocking situation of his life. While he was going through the specifics, Charles let out a quick exhalation. Over the course of several months, Thomas had been without a house, sleeping in his van and washing his face in public facilities before each job. He was unable to find a new place to live before he was evicted, since he had fallen behind on his rent payments due to escalating costs. As he did not have any relatives to turn to and was subject to stringent job obligations, he had no other options. On the other hand, he came to Buckingham Palace each day, put on his uniform, and remained still for a considerable amount of time, acting as if nothing was amiss. Charles pressed his fingers into the leather binding of the folder as he closed it. He received a sensation that he had not anticipated. It's anger. The system that has allowed this to occur should not be blamed, nor Thomas. Discipline, order, and tradition were all things that the monarchs took great delight in. What use were those things, however, if they were unable to satisfy the same people who were supporting them? What number of other people were in situations that were comparable to theirs, quietly suffering while the rest of the world strolled by, assuming that everything was fine? He thought about the previous day, the moment when Thomas hesitated before taking the notepad, and the slight shame that appeared in his eyes. The revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. Thomas was dreading the possibility that Charles would take notice. After all, what would happen if a ruler was aware of the truth? In a quiet and deliberate manner, Charles rose up and pushed his chair back. His initial impulse was to jump into action right now, to locate Thomas. Make sure you get answers. Now is the time to fix this. But he was able to stop himself. Not at all about charitable giving. The issue was one of dignity. If he walked in like a king or queen and began doling out favors, it would only serve to make Thomas feel more insignificant. No. Handling this matter with caution was required. It is with respect. After taking a moment to catch his breath, he touched a button that was located on his desk. The voice of a secretary could be heard crackling via the intercom. Your Majesty?" Charles suggested that a private meeting be organized, together with Thomas Whitaker. At this moment, there is a pause. "Please, sir, the Royal Guard." Charles's tone was authoritative. "Yes, and you should inform him. There is no need for him to be concerned, mostly due to the fact that everything was going to change after today." With his heart throbbing in his chest, Thomas Whitaker stood outside the private office that was located inside Buckingham Palace while the afternoon wore on. In a situation like this, a royal guard is never called upon. Had he committed an error in judgment? Had he been reported by individuals? He had always arrived on time, demonstrating his very meticulous nature, constantly making sure that his uniform was as presentable as it could possibly be. On the other hand, he was aware of the reality. He was aware of it. A member of the staff opened the door and indicated for him to enter. King Charles was seated behind a magnificent desk made of wood. On the other hand, his posture did not exhibit any formal stiffness. There is no semblance of judgment, just a calm and observant moment. "Who is Thomas? Is it the case?" The tone of Charles's voice was unruffled. "Thank you, Your Majesty." There was a lengthy pause. Following that, Charles made a little forward tilt. "The formalities are not going to be a waste of your time. I went through your file." Thomas felt a twisting sensation in his stomach. Behind his back, he did a tightening of his hands, a relic from one's experiences in military training. This is the moment. This is the lecture. It was a dismissal. But rather than that, Charles posed a straightforward inquiry. "When did you decide not to inform anyone?" Thomas exhibited some reluctance. Why was he meant to respond to that question? How was he supposed to describe the pure humiliation that it was? Who would have thought that a guy who was responsible for protecting the monarchy would be unable to even prevent his own life from falling apart. "The last thing I wanted was to be a burden on you, sir." Despite the fact that his hands were clammy, his speech was steady. "We are prepared to face adversity, without exception, to serve others." Charles regarded him for a considerable amount of time. Then, in a tone that was milder than what was anticipated, he asked, "But who takes care of you, Thomas?" The word struck me like a direct blow to the stomach. No one had ever inquired about that before, not serving in the military. "It is not in training." "Of course, not at this location," Thomas mumbled, his throat tightening. "I don't require any exceptions or special treatment." Charles heaved a sigh and shook his head, saying, "I'll figure it out." "This is not the point at all." The hands were folded together in a fist. "As you did, I took an oath to serve the people who are under this institution, and you took an oath to serve this institution." The feeling of something that was dangerously close to emotion rising up his throat caused Thomas to swallow hard. "That includes you," he said. For a period of months, he had pretended that everything was good, and he had managed to keep things together through sheer force of will. And at this very moment, the monarch himself was making an offer to assist. However, Charles was not finished. While he sat back, his gaze remained unmoved. "You will no longer be able to lay down and sleep in your vehicle as of today." Thomas became surprised and blinked. "You, sir?" Charles continued by saying, "I have already made arrangements for accommodations for you. Plus, it's not just you. I put in a request for a comprehensive assessment of the way in which we treat our military personnel. This is not going to happen again." Thomas had a hard time processing what was being said. A place to live? Assistance? Is that the case now? This was the first time in a very long time that he was completely at a loss for words. And the King of England? He did not express gratitude in any way. What he was doing was just what ought to have been done from the beginning. With a confused expression on his face, Thomas left the king's office. As part of his training, he was instructed to hold his composure, to maintain a straight stance, and to keep his face unreadable. On the other hand, his entire world had just shifted inside out. It could not have been real. In front of him, the monarch had sat him down, looked him in the eye, and informed him that things were going to undergo a transformation, for him, as well as for other people who were similar to him. He was suddenly standing in a quiet corridor of Buckingham Palace, clutching a set of keys that he had not been holding for the previous hour. And now, here he was. The keys to a home, your very own home. Outside, where a car was waiting for him, he was directed by an assistant. The individual stated, "We'll take you there now," as if everything was entirely normal, as if it was simply another errand that was performed on a regular basis. However, Thomas's experience was anything but that. The car arrived at a small apartment building in a quiet district of London that was cozy despite its lack of grandeur. It is not extravagant, but it is clean and secure. It is his. After entering the unit, Thomas did nothing but stand there at that moment. It smelt clean, like a fresh start, and the air was crisp. The furnishings were uncomplicated but intimate. There is a bed, a couch, and a tiny kitchen. A real bed, as opposed to the confined space in the back seat of his car. For a number of months, he had persuaded himself that he did not require this, that he was able to persevere through it all, that requesting assistance was a sign of weakness. But this was not a charitable act. It possessed dignity. It appeared as though he was afraid to disturb the space as he carefully laid his luggage down. The countertop, the light switch, and the edge of the bed that had been meticulously made were all touched by his hands. It is entirely his. Subsequently, he observed a note sitting on the diminutive dining table. The royal seal was affixed to it. After taking a deep breath, he picked it up and unfolded the wrinkled piece of paper. "You, Thomas, have devoted your entire life to helping other people. Now is the moment for someone to serve you. How are you doing?" Mr. Charles R. Thomas's realization caused the words to become hazy. He had tears in his eyes. There was no reason for a royal guard to shed tears. On the other hand, he allowed himself to feel it at that precise moment, while he was standing in his new home and clutching a letter from the most powerful man in Britain, mostly due to the fact that he was not merely surviving for the first time in a very long time. He was still alive. When Thomas awoke the following morning, he was lying on a proper bed. He did not remember where he was for a brief period of time. This was not the roof of his car. It was the ceiling. Leather chairs were not stiff, and the mattress was not. None of the air was chilly. Then it dawned on him. The event was not a dream. Still attempting to make sense of everything that had happened, he sat up and rubbed his hands over his face. The king had provided him with a place to call home. It was no longer the case that he was merely an invisible guard standing in formation. He was observed. The outfit that he wore was neatly arranged over a chair, having been properly laundered and pressed, just as it was scheduled to be. In the process of running his fingertips over the fresh fabric, he recalled how worn it had been just a few days earlier. When he went back to Buckingham Palace today, he would not be the same man who was merely attempting to prevent his life from falling apart. After that, he would be a soldier who stood tall once more. Almost immediately after Thomas took his position outside the royal gates, he became aware of the new circumstances. His uniform was spotless and flawless. His posture appeared to be more robust. The burden that had been resting on his shoulders, not only the physical one, but also the crushing tiredness that came with surviving, had been lifted. After that, something occurred that was on the verge of breaking his form. The King of England strolled by. If the king were to walk by the guards, it was not an unusual occurrence. But something was different this time when he got closer to the scene. Each of the other guards straightened up a little bit more as they went before them. Not a single official command was issued. Nothing was said aloud. They were all aware of it. It was heard by them. And just as King Charles was passing away, something took place that had never taken place in all of Thomas's years of devotion. His Majesty gave him a little nod. A modest gesture, to be sure. This is not a public report. Just a straightforward and unassuming acknowledgement. Thomas could feel it in his backbone. For his entire life, he had been preparing himself to serve the crown. He never anticipated that the crown would be of service to him, and he was taken aback by that moment in his life. If a monarch is able to see the hardships of one of his own guards and make a change in his life overnight, what does this indicate about the power of merely noticing the people around us?